Welcome back. I'm Chris Temple, and we have yet another update as we're going to be doing a few of these things now. We're hitting just about the halfway mark of 2024. Today, I'm going to be joined in just a minute by my friend Greg Beischer. He's a CEO of Alaska Energy Metals. As you see here on the screen, they're listed on the Toronto Venture Exchange under the symbol AEMC. Here in the US on the OTCQB, it's AKEMF. Greg and or myself might be making what could be construed as forward-looking statements, might be a couple of them. So we want to let you know that as well. You know, everybody can make plans and sincerely carry them out. They might come to fruition, they might not. They might not be as fast as you want. And of course, in all manner of mineral exploration, there's always risk. That said, if you remember from my previous writing about Alaska Energy Metals, those of you who were already part of my regular audience, or better still, if you've looked at the video interview I did with Greg back at the beginning of the year, if you didn't, I'd encourage you to do so. And get a lot more background. Their main asset is the Nikolai Project in Alaska. This already has, as you're going to hear Greg recap it, this is following an upgrade to the resource estimate back in February, subsequent to the discussion I had with Greg back then. There's 8+ billion pounds of nickel equivalent at this project between inferred and indicated. It's a massive land package. It's in the southern part of Alaska. It's in a good location. It's in a great jurisdiction. And Greg's going to speak to that a little bit as well when we get going. Notably here, and we covered this before, and this to me is one of the big hooks, folks, of this story. You see on the map here the two main claim blocks that Alaska Energy Metals has. Nikolai is comprised of the Eureka claims, which is where this 8+ billion pound resource is. But to the east of that, and that's going to be the focus of this summer's activity by and large, is Canwell. That is an area where there have been some past discoveries of some extraordinarily high grade polymetallic material, platinum group metals, nickel, cobalt, copper, all kinds of stuff, and we're gonna talk about that and about the drilling plans for there for this summer. Likewise, we'll get a quick update on the Quebec projects that the company has. But on this map again here with the Nikolai project, you see in blue or purplish blue these two claim blocks that are owned by Kobold Minerals. And this is a company that, as I've explained before, is very interesting. It was put together and funded, or private, chiefly by Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates. A couple of household names, I'm sure, that you recognize. And they, as does Alaska Energy Metals, and as do we, as investors and commentators and whatnot, are looking to the future needs to fill these supply gaps that we have in critical metals of pretty much all types. So Kobold likes this particular region as well. It's been relatively underexplored in the past. There's extraordinary upside by all appearances, and this is going to, I think, one day be talked about in the same kind of sentences as the Abitibi or the Golden Triangle in Canada, as the state of Nevada when it comes to precious metals and so forth. There's massive, massive, and largely untapped potential that Alaska has for nickel and most everything else. So we're going to get into all of that with Greg, and when we wrap up in a little bit, we're going to talk about their current capital raise and what their plans are for Canwell. And here is Greg Beischer back with us, the CEO of Alaska Energy Metals. Greg, thanks for joining me this Father's Day weekend.
Good afternoon, Chris. Yeah, nice bright sunny day here in Anchorage, Alaska. It's nice.
Well, and it certainly is down here in Florida too. I'm in the dry half of Florida right now. We still got drought condition in the northern part of the state. The southern half is underwater the last several days. But anyway, as I introduced before, I just brought you on. The Nikolai Project in Alaska is a premier one. It's one that I think is going to be getting more attention, perhaps, from the federal government in terms of funding. Fingers crossed. We'll talk about that when we get to the overall financial situation down the line. But before we get back to Nikolai, I want to talk about, and you've made several announcements recently. Back after you and I did a video in January, you upgraded the resource estimate at Nikolai, and this is a massive area that seems there's little question that down the road, given the money and opportunity, you can expand this. But give us the grand total again, just to remind folks one more time of what you're up to in inferred and indicated resources at the Eureka claims.
Yeah, it really actually even surprised us at how large the resource was able to get. But thankfully, all the historical drill hole data that we purchased met all of the quality control and quality assurance requirements. And so along with the new drilling we did in 2023, about half of the deposit is already drilled to the indicated level. That's about 3.9 billion pounds of nickel documented in the ground. And then the rest of the deposit is known at the inferred level, a bit less drill hole density, but inferred is still good. And there's another 4.2 billion pounds there of nickel. Now, as the geologist in charge of that work, I'm not supposed to add inferred with indicated, but you could, Chris. 3.9 billion plus 4.2 billion comes out to just over 8 billion pounds of nickel documented in the ground. And there's substantial amounts of copper, cobalt, platinum, and palladium to go with it. It's a polymetallic deposit. There's also chromium and iron in it too, and we haven't actually factored that in yet, because that's one place where the historical drill hole assay information was not of modern quality. And so the results for chromium in particular were biased low in the historical data. So we haven't included, but yet those can be very, very important metals. I know that on a comparison company project, Canada Nickel, they are now going to be producing a ferrochrome product, iron chrome rich concentrate from their deposit, and it's quite important to the economics. So we will factor that in at some point. But yeah, it's a polymetallic deposit. So far, nickel accounts for about 75% of the value of the metal in the deposit. But there's definitely contributions from other critical and strategic metals that should be of interest to the United States.
Well, and this thing is, and I had the map and the information up a little bit earlier before I brought you on. It's a massive property, and one of the great things about it going forward, and even though you legally and as a practical matter need to make the distinction between inferred and indicated resources, the reason you were able to turn some of those prior inferred resources into indicated and have some optimism over what is still left is that this is a very uniform resource.
Yes.
I mean, the mineralization, it's like you poke a hole here and a few hundred kilometers, a few hundred meters rather, this direction, and it's all like a carbon copy. It's all very uniform, and that's going to be nice if it stays that way. And engineering and economics confirm that this can be mined. I mean, that's a nice problem to have just there's not going to be a whole lot of question as to what the hot spots are. It's all there.
Truly, it's an amazingly homogeneous deposit. It's just this thick, 300-meter thick slab of mineralized rock we think is a sill or series of sills. but it goes for kilometers. We've drilled off perhaps 4 kilometers, but we can trace it geochemically and geophysically for at least 10 kilometers. It's open at depth and it's open in both directions from where we are now. So it could be a lot bigger. And I think, finding a few higher grade pods would be really helpful. And that'll be part of our goal going forward. You know that on these large bulk tonnage deposits, whether they're gold or they're copper or now nickel, rapid payback of capital is important because they are capital intensive. It costs a lot to build a mine of that style. And so if you've got some higher grade pods of mineralization that can help with that payback, it'll help with the overall economics. But certainly major mining companies should be quite attractive to this style of deposit and to this deposit in particular, because they could see that they could mine away for decades, a very uniform grade or concentration of metal, and that's really right up the alley of some of the bigger mining companies in the world.
Well, speaking of high grade in the Nikolai claim block, we're going to come back in a minute to Canwell, but I want to take a quick detour because it's another more recent story of property acquisition you just made. You announced last month that you're getting an option on what are called the Bambino claims. Now these are adjacent to the Anglier claims that you already have in Quebec, which similarly is a multi-metal story potentially. You've got copper, nickel, etc. Real quick, Greg, tell us before we get back to I think the highlight I think of this summer's drilling at Canwell back in Alaska. Tell us a bit about what your plans are in Quebec and why you added this one land package recently.
Right. Well, it's a similar story to Nikolai in some ways. Chris, you'll recall that as a young geologist, I worked for the major nickel mining company, Inco.
Inco, right?
And that's the company that sent me here to Alaska to search for nickel. In fact, right at the Nikolai Project that we've now reclaimed. But the project that we picked up last year in Quebec and that we recently added to with a smaller claim block has a similar story in that for some years I was stationed in Quebec with Inco and had done research in this particular area of Western Quebec. And I became quite interested at the time, but then got moved on to Alaska, and I never followed it up until recently. And I was able to reacquire some of the mineral rights in that area that of which I had become intrigued all those decades ago. And so it's an early stage project. It is secondary to Nikolai at the moment, but we raised flow through capital last December. So we're active in the field right now with a major soil sampling program that's targeting high grade nickel sulfides. The geology here in this area is reminiscent of the Raglan area of far northern Quebec, where there's very substantial, massive sulfide-rich nickel deposits, or of Kambalda in Western Australia. Again, very, very rich deposits. And so that's what we target here. We will use the geophysical approach also because those massive nickel sulfide deposits respond very, very well to geophysics. So, Quebec is just a great jurisdiction in which to explore. They really understand the importance of mining to their economy, to our society generally. And they really go out of their way to attract the mining industry to explore and develop and mine in their province. And so I'm very happy to be back there. Our cost of exploration is really quite low there. Between low cost of capital through flow through financing and even through rebates that we receive after executing the exploration. So very attractive jurisdiction.
Well, you can't do a whole lot better than Quebec. You know, the conference that you and I were at, where we saw one another most recently, several weeks back in Washington, it was put on by the Northern Miner and the Precious Metals Summit folks. Quebec had a representation there. A couple weeks later, I was at the Critical Trends in Mining Finance in New York City. Quebec had a presence there. They're making themselves known. They're not the only Canadian province, certainly that is, but I have to say that they're probably the most aggressive one. Ontario would argue, and Doug Ford would argue, but they're
Yeah,
both doing a pretty good job and trying to do what they can to bring a lot of ability to control our own destiny in North America back
right.
here. You know, with these homespun products. So this is going to be a season of greenfield work, getting drill targets ready, but you're not going to be drilling quite yet there in Quebec.
No, I suspect that we'll raise a little more flow through financing late in 2024 to look to drilling in 2025, though, you know, it could be winter 2025 drilling, and that was part of the rationale for having a second project because it's one where you can drill in the winter quite
Right.
readily. And in fact, when I was an active geologist in Quebec, we couldn't wait for winter because so many of the areas in which we would explore are sort of muskeg covered, and
Yeah.
it was just a lot easier to get around once it's all frozen.
Yeah, no, all that boggy stuff when in the winter time, that's your time to hit it. Well, that'll be a nice story for the future, but let's come back to what the main event, by all appearances, is going to be this year back in Alaska. And you were talking about the possibility of maybe high grade pods down the road in the Eureka claims in order to juice the early economics on that. But when you and I saw one another in Washington, you showed me this specimen here that I've got on the screen. I sure as hell wouldn't want to get hit in the head with this thing. I'll tell you that, folks. And this is something that you literally cut from surface. It was a surface expression of the mineralization, extraordinarily high grade. And so this is a Canwell block, and this is what you have announced chiefly a $3 million additional raise that you're in the process of doing right now to drill this season. And I know that when we were discussing this a couple of times in the past, you discussed how the potential exists for a substantially higher grade resource down the road than what you have, even if it's a big, relatively lower grade one at Nikolai. This thing could really be a barn burner. So tell us a little bit about Canwell. I know distance wise, it's not terribly far, and notably, and I'll put this up again as well, that I started with before you came on, but Kobold is on either side of Canwell on this trend.
Yes.
There's a good reason for that, folks. But what did you see at Canwell, and what makes you think that with some drilling you might be able to hit more of this kind of thing that you found at surface?
Right. Well, the history goes back pretty far. It was my team of geologists back in 1997 that first discovered this massive sulfide sitting right at surface on the Canwell block of claims, which at the time, though, was much smaller. And it was sort of a patchwork of claims, and it was difficult for my employer, Inco, and myself as the manager to really put together a cohesive land package to explore. And that hampered us a bit back then. And so we weren't able to do the level of work that now Alaska Energy Metals has. And honestly, Chris, I've been salivating over drilling this spot now for almost 3 decades. We were able to drill a couple of holes back in the late 90s with Enco, and other companies came along and poked a couple short little holes, but no one's done this spot justice. But we restrained ourselves last year. We didn't drill any holes at Canwell, but we did all the ground geophysical surveys that prudent explorers should do before drilling. And we've put together a really great picture. They're compelling targets. On the slide deck, you could look at a place called Odie. It's a mineral occurrence called Odie, where we've got blocks of sulfide, massive sulfide at surface that grades 4 or 5% nickel with copper and with platinum and palladium, and even the more rare platinum group elements. But beneath that, now that we've done the geophysical work, we can see this very strong conductor. And that's a great thing about nickel sulfide. Massive nickel sulfide is an excellent electromagnetic conductor. And also that massive nickel sulfide is magnetic. And so if you pass a magnetometer over top of a good sized deposit, you get a very strong magnetic susceptibility response. And so when you have a coincident magnetic and electromagnetic response, especially when it's right below sulfide mineralization sticking out of the ground at surface, that's a compelling drill target. And I can't wait for our crews to turn the drill bit there, and that should commence as during the first week of July, just a few weeks from now. That's one thing about this mineralization. We can see it. We'll know if we hit it. But then assays will be, a couple months later. We could probably expect assays from this work in October.
Okay, cool. And I mentioned that you're raising 3 million right now to fund this, and for other ancillary purposes, I would suspect. It's been a tough environment though, Greg. And I mean, even with a lot of people see the headlines of you had big moves in 2024 in precious metals, yet if you look at the average exploration stock, they've barely budged. Unfortunately, at least near term, a lot of the base metals had pretty significant declines after big runs. They bounced recently, and I suspect that the lows are in there. But between being a junior exploration company, number one, and number two with nickel, kind of like lithium, but not as bad as lithium in some ways, selling off from pretty big rallies, didn't do the share price a whole heck of a lot of good. And so I know that you're being judicious right now in raising just what you need to give a good go this season with Canwell, even though you would like to do more and could be doing more. So give us a landscape of the capital structure, what your thoughts are. And then I also want you to discuss with the folks, and of course nothing's guaranteed, but you've got an application into the Defense Department under the Defense Production Act and one other provision for some funding. And I mentioned earlier the conference that you and I were at in Washington, and the same message came through in New York. Even more so than the Energy Department, which through the IRA and other means has started funding some critical metals projects in the US. The Defense Department has been substantially more aggressive in what they've been funding, and even outside the US, they're funding projects, and even in Canada and elsewhere. So at least there's somebody in Washington taken very seriously that we got to get our act together belatedly and do this. So that's my little quick sermonette, but let me turn it over to you, and you give us a run through the specifics.
Sure thing. Well, yes, we last week announced that we are raising 3 million Canadian dollars. The project deserves a lot more, but we're very mindful about diluting our existing shareholder base. So 3 million is something that we can really put to good use, and that could certainly move the needle on our share price. But it's not just a financing that was announced. We also announced some additions to potential additions, assuming they're elected at our upcoming annual general meeting, additional board members, as well as advisory board members. And these are people that have great track records as mining entrepreneurs. They're very capital markets savvy. This project is going to need capital. And so this really bolsters the economic strength of our company. And I'm happy to have these people joining us. Um, so that we have to look forward to. I'm pretty confident with it. We'll have no trouble to raise this money, but it is dilutive. Our share price is being depressed all the way down to 15 cents. Part of it is the nickel narrative. Part of it, frankly, was maybe a mistake on our part. We probably should have raised the capital we needed for this summer back in February when we first announced our large resource at the Eureka deposit. But that's water under the bridge now. We have to deal with it. And so this is a dilutive financing, but it's a fantastic opportunity for shareholders that are buying in now. In fact, I expect to see a pretty significant rebound once we complete the financing and have that money in our treasury, and everyone can see that we're really going to drill those compelling targets at Canwell. So yeah, it's good. And yeah, you mentioned the possibility that we will get government grant funding. And of course, yeah, the financing we're doing now is really expensive capital. But if we were to get grant funding from the government through the Defense Production Act, that would really be inexpensive capital, and our overall average cost of capital since the start of our company a year ago would be actually quite low. I really think we have a strong chance of receiving these grants. I know there's a lot of competition for them, but this is a project that checks the boxes on a lot of critical and strategic metals. Nickel is an especially important one for electric energy transition. Its main use, nickel, is stainless steel. That use is never going away. It gets bigger every year as our human population grows. And there's myriad uses for nickel, but now there's a whole new use in electric vehicle batteries. 64 pounds or 29 kilos in every single average EV battery. And so, nickel is truly going to be in big demand. And the United States has one small nickel mine, and the product is exported to Canada. So, the U.S. is vulnerable. It's really reliant on a lot of other countries for metals, generally nickel in particular. And so, to me, for the U.S. to have a great big nickel deposit on U.S. soil, one would think that the federal government would fund projects on American soil before they'd fund ones in Canada. Canada's a great neighbor and does provide a lot of metal to the U.S. But I've heard of some of these grants going to African countries as well. And, to me, it should be America first. We've got fantastic resources in Alaska. Our Senator Murkowski's been pounding the table for over a decade saying that the United States is really vulnerable on metals, especially the critical and strategic metals, and that our state, Alaska, can provide so much mineral wealth to the country if we just get out there and make explorers feel welcome. Then we'll spend the money, we'll find the deposits, and we'll deliver that metal to America. So I'm very hopeful that our grant application will be positively viewed, and that in the coming months we'll receive that grant funding. It's a significant amount of money for which we've applied. We've seen a graphite project right here in Alaska get a big government grant. So I think we've got a really decent chance here.
That's good. Well, I think you do too. And you said you check a lot of boxes. Nickel's important, with the exception of that one little mine, Eagle, that you referred to in Michigan, that what their slight production, which I don't think is going to be around a whole heck of a lot longer. There's several development stage and near development stage nickel projects that are bottled up in Minnesota. But this is something we can't go without forever. And the good thing that we saw at these conferences recently is that more and more people within the administration are starting to get this, just how dire this is, just how much China is still, they're not wringing their hands over obsessing over multiple layers of regulations and lawsuits and many years to permit stuff. That's why they're leading in all of these areas of metals processing especially. And we are going to need to catch up a whole lot faster. And the good thing is that you and I have discussed before about Nikolai is that you're not really in an environmentally sensitive area. There's not any ESG big marks against you, that kind of thing. It's a good area. And with the kind of neighbors you've got with Kobold, they know that as well. And I wonder if that might be something that the people reviewing your application look at and say, gee, this might be a lot bigger area here. We should get our foot, in the door and get this district established.
Right. Yeah, I'm very hopeful, Chris.
Okay.
I think the country deserves it.
Well, we do. So anyway, well, folks, as I said early on, make sure that you keep up with Alaska Energy Metals. As we are recording this on the weekend, on June the 15th, that offering is still open and active, correct? So if anyone's listening, they're an accredited investor, make sure you reach out to Greg or myself and get the information that you need on this. I think it's a great opportunity myself, obviously. So Greg, keep up the good work, and I'll look forward to seeing longer drill intercepts like that brick I didn't want to get hit over the head with.
Yeah, it's amazing that brick, that's a sample that we collected from surface and sawed it to sort of the shape of the brick, weighs about 15 pounds. It's an amazingly dense material. And
when you showed me, when you showed me that, twice in my life have I ever had anything like that in my hand. At one time was a kilo of gold that had been poured at one of the mines I'd visited. Of course, gold is uber dense, so when you got a brick of gold, that's pretty darn heavy. And then I mentioned Minnesota a minute ago. A few summers ago, I took a bunch of my children and grandchildren on a tour of the old Sudan iron mine. And a lot of that ore, that raw ore is kind of like that. That thing that you showed me was heavier than what I picked up at the Sudan mine.
Yeah. So you can imagine that if there was a deposit, say, of 10 million tons of that material, it actually wouldn't take up all that much space because it's such dense material. And so it'd be a very compact, rich deposit, extremely valuable. 10 million tons of that grade would be a rich standalone mineable ore body that would make a great profit. But even if it turns out that we have a few pods of high grade mineralization like that of, say, 500,000 tons, that's still really valuable. It would make a great little starter pit to help with that rapid payback of the capital of a mill that ultimately would treat the bulk tonnage disseminated nickel deposit at Eureka. So this is an extremely important drilling here, and I'm really hoping we can tie into that rich nickel sulfide material. Rich nickel sulfide deposits of large scale are exceedingly rare. The last sort of globally significant such deposit, I think, was Voisey's Bay, and that's over 30 years ago now. So we don't find them very often, but I'm hopeful that this summer we will find a really significant nickel deposit.
Well, we're all hopeful, and we'll be staying in touch, and folks will keep you informed as well. So Greg, thanks again for joining me, and I look forward to the next time our paths cross.
It's always a pleasure, Chris, and I hope tomorrow you have a great Father's Day.
And you as well. Take care.
For much more of the National Investor's cutting-edge content and actionable investment opportunities, make sure to subscribe to Chris's free content at nationalinvestor.com. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel too. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.